All right, welcome back. We're going to move into the next presentation topic in Unit 6, which is going to deal with the nervous system, which is learning targets 5 through 8. Typically in class, we take a couple of days to get through the nervous system. So you can split this video up into 2 days or 2 different times of the day, however you want to do it, or one time, in all. It's going to be a fairly lengthy video in comparison to what is normally put out. So the nervous system, long story short, is going to control all functions of the body through the sending and receiving of electrical signals or electrical messages. Okay, the nervous system is going to receive information using the senses to gather information about the environment or around it or the body itself, and use that information to integrate it, which means to decipher that data, and then put out a response, whether it be a conscious decision or an automatic response. So the nervous system is composed of 3 main areas. It's composed of the brain, spinal cord, and individual nerve cells. So there's two divisions of the two anatomical divisions of the nervous system. You have the central nervous system, which is going to be the brain and the spinal cord, and then you have the peripheral nervous system, which are all other nerve cells in the body. You also have two functional divisions of the nervous system. You have the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that is going to act without conscious input. Okay, for instance, if the temperature gets too high around you, then your body is automatically going to respond to that by sweating. Okay, you don't have to make the decision to tell your body to start sweating. Somatic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's going to act according to the organism's conscious input. And what that means is say, let's go back to that previous example, is you're sweating, you're hot, and then you feel that you're hot, and you make the conscious decision to go somewhere to cool off based off the data that is gathered from your nervous system. So the nervous system pathway goes in, long story short, this order here, sensory input. So you have some sort of, I call it data. It's some sort of input received from a sense organ or some internal sensor. We're talking about, temperature or maybe hunger or maybe some type of stressor. Pain can even be a sensory input. Then you have what's called integration. And this is when the brain takes that information and processes it before sending a response out. Okay? And again, this could be a conscious thought process, or it could be something that's automatically responded to. And number 3, you have a motor output, usually performed by either a gland or a muscle, and this is a response of the brain. And we're going to talk about some situations where not all of the decisions are made at the brain. You have some made at the spinal cord, and you have some made at the brainstem. But some type of response is going to be put out to whatever stressor or sensory input you're getting, or a body or an animal is getting. So, for instance, you see a glass of water, meaning you're thirsty. You want to take a drink. That's all sensory input. That information is sent to the brain. The brain decides how to achieve that goal. Then the brain puts out the motor input information to cause you to pick up the glass, flex the muscle, bend the arm, so on and so forth, up to the mouth, take a drink, swallow. You get where I'm going with this. So the neuron structure, very important for you to know the neuron structure. Neuron, of course, is a nerve cell. You need to be able to label the neuron structure. Okay, so if you want to write this down, and then I believe, let me make sure, yes, in the next slide, we actually have a diagram. If you want to pause or draw one in your notes, I would suggest it, or find one online to put in your virtual notes. So first you have the cell body, which is going to be the center of the nerve cell. This is where the signals are going to be gathered before being sent to the axon. Then you have dendrites, which are part of the cell that receive input from other nerves or sensory receptors. Then you have the axon, and this is the part of the neuron that sends the message to the next neuron or another output source. Axon terminal is the end of the axon, and a synapse is the space between the axon terminal and the effector cell, or the cell where the message is being sent. Myelin sheath is the substance coating the neuron to insulate the signal and protect the surrounding tissues from electric shock. In class the other day, we talked about how the nervous system sends electrical messages, and how is it possible for that to be without our bodies being slightly shocked? Well, the myelin sheath is insulation, much like coating on wires, keeps the electricity where it's supposed to be. All right, so if you want to kind of pause the video here and either put this in your notes or label this in your notes or however you want to go about it, you will need to be able to label a neuron. And so you can see the nucleus here, the myelin sheath, the axon terminal, the end, okay, the dendrites. So the electrical message will come from the left of your screen to the right towards the dendrites, be interpreted in the nucleus, then sent through the axon as an electrical signal. Once it gets to the axon terminal, it's going to be sent across the synapse, which is to the next set of dendrites, so on and so forth. Nerve impulse. So a nerve impulse is also known as action potential, is propagated down the length of the nerve through the diffusion of ions across the membrane. We've talked about diffusion. We've talked about concentration gradients before. You need to refresh on that before we understand where the electrical impulse comes from. When the nerve is at rest, sodium ions from this point forward will be referred to as Na+, are concentrated on the outside of the cell, and potassium ions, K+, is concentrated on the inside of the cell. So we've created two different types of concentration gradients, one with sodium ions and one with potassium ions. So we'll see here you'll have pumps that are going to allow these concentration gradients to flow across the membrane, which is going to, of course, create the potential to do work, ATP, much like it does in any other type of diffusion. So the outside of the nerve cell is going to be more positive than the inside, which is going to be slightly negative. This is creating a charge differential or concentration gradient. When this differential exists, the cell is at resting potential, or it has the ability to act, but it's at rest. The cell uses sodium and potassium pumps in order to maintain this charge differential. Big thing to remember here. When the charge differential or the concentration gradient exists, that means the cell's at rest. Okay? It has a potential to do work, but it's not working at that point. So here we see positive and negative charges based off sodium and potassium concentration gradients. So the steps of a nerve impulse. Stimulus acts on the nerve, whether from the preceding section of the nerve or from the sensory input. This stimulus is going to cause the sodium channels to open, or the sodium pumps to open, causing the sodium outside the cell to rush into the cell, getting rid of the concentration gradient. Remember, nature wants to be at equilibrium. So once that channel is open, in other words, the floodgates are open, sodium ions are going to rush into the cell. This is going to depolarize the cell, which means it's going to take away that charge differential that we talked about a few slides ago. This is going to create a positive charge inside the cell as well. When the positive charge reaches a certain level, the signal is fired, creating the action potential. At this point, potassium is going to rush outside of the cell in order to repolarize the cell. Remember, it's a high concentration of potassium atoms inside the cell, not outside. So when the potassium pump channels open, the potassium is going to rush out of the cell. This is going to repolarize or make that charge differential in the cell. Resting potential is obtained through the use of sodium and potassium pumps. And that is what you see here, okay? The resting state, you see sodium's outside, potassium's inside. Depolarization, sodium comes in. Rising phase of action, sodium continues to come in. Then potassium rushes out, which is going to repolarize the cell. All right, so propagation. Propagation is going to be the movement of the signal down the length of the nerve. Okay, so we've gathered the signal, we've interpreted the signal, and we're going to propagate it down the length of the axon to be able to be sent as a nerve impulse out of the axon terminal. Excuse me. Synaptic activity. This is the transfer of the signal across the synapse, which involves the electrical signal being translated into a chemical one, then back to an electrical signal. So action potential arrives at the end of the axon, or also known as the axon terminal. Vesicles of the neurotransmitter fuse with membrane of the axon. Neurotransmitters release into the synapse. The receptors of dendrites receive neurotransmitters, and the neuron is depolarized and action potential continues. So electric current within the neuron, chemical message in the synapse, which is the space in between the neurons. And that's what we see here, okay? So electric current all through here, electric signal gets to the end, then we're going to have a chemical signal until it is taken up by the dendrites and is turned back into an electrical signal. All right, so we're going to move into the brain now. We'll focus on the human brain, mammal brain for the most part here. So the brain is divided into three main parts: the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the processing center of the brain, and this is where conscious thought is going to be put in. So it's going to be divided into four lobes. You have the frontal lobe, which is where you're going to find reason, speech, and emotion. The parietal lobe, which is where you're going to find movement, orientation, and perception. Occipital lobe, which is where your visual processing is going to occur. Temporal lobe, which is auditory processing, memory, and speech. Your cerebellum is involuntary motor control, meaning that this is where the automatic responses to stimuli occurs. And we also see that happening in the brainstem. So you have involuntary functions like the maintenance of homeostasis in the body. So sometimes some information never makes it to the brain. The brain is going to delegate things, so to speak, and the brainstem is really responsible for maintaining homeostasis. And you can see here you have your different parts of the brain, brainstem, cerebellum, all the lobes, so on and so forth. So the spinal cord. The spinal cord is a central cord where all nerves will eventually connect and have connection to the brain. Okay, so it's like a network of fiber optic cables, if you want to think about it that way. So you have a bunch of little cables running throughout the body that's receiving information, collecting information, communicating all over the body, and its mother port, so to speak, its home base, whatever you want to call it, is the spinal cord. All of these nerve cells are eventually going to connect to the spinal cord. Okay. And that is where that information is going to be sent up the spinal cord towards the brainstem, so towards the cerebrum, towards the or the cerebellum, towards the brain, all the lobes, wherever it needs to go. Reflex arc. This is when integration takes place on the spinal cord rather than the brain. So a great example is when you have your reflex tested on, say, your knee with the reflex hammer when you go for physical. Okay, that reflex is not done in the brain. It's not done in the brain stem. It never makes it there. Okay, it's an actual response that's built into your spinal cord. Again, maybe there's some situations in an animal's life where response needs to happen faster. Reflexes are one of those. Reflexes are reflexes for a reason because they have to happen quickly. In order for them to happen quickly, then they must be housed in the spinal cord. And this is what's known as a reflex arc. All right, so sensory receptors, we've talked about senses, and you understand your senses, your sight, your hearing, your taste, your smell, your touch, all those things. You've been taught that before. But they all have receptors, okay? These receptors are responsible for gathering information on certain things. So there are five main types of sensory receptors that gather information. You have pain receptors, which of course are going to gather information about pain. You have thermoreceptors, which are going to, of course, gather information on the temperature. Mechanoreceptors, which are going to gather information on touch and vibrations, whether it be with, sometimes your hearing aid, or you're not hearing aid, your eardrums detects vibrations along with how you feel, what you touch. Chemoreceptors, chemical, this be taste and some smell. Photoreceptors, light, of course, is sight. So sensory organs, so the eye is going to contain receptors called rods and cones on the retina, and it's going to send light information to the brain, which is going to create an image. Eye is actually pretty complex. So the ear is going to contain hair-like receptors that detect the movement of fluids inside a structure called a cochlea. And it's a semicircular canals, or semicircular canals are also going to aid in balance. So your eardrum, so to speak, yes, it helps with hearing, but it also has to do with your orientation. It helps you stand upright, so to speak. It gives you balance. Nose and mouth are going to be the chemoreceptors, which detect the taste and smell of chemicals. Odors are detected by sensors in the nose that connect directly to the brain. Taste and smell work hand in hand. You can manipulate the body and the brain by eliminating the smell, which is while you taste something, which is going to make something taste completely different. And then last but not least, I believe, is skin. And there's many receptors on the skin that send information about the outside world to the brain, okay? Temperature, light, humidity, weather, so on and so forth. The skin is a really big sensory organ for most organisms. That is the end of Learning Target 5 through 8. So be sure you complete the form that goes with this. If you have questions, let me know. Thank you.